Okay, good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here with you. This, for me personally, is the first time I've sat here and given a class in 2 years. Yeah, I've just stayed home with all my classes, even though we could have come in. I've been doing them from home. I've done Sunday service, so it's not that I've not been in here, but it's very odd when time passes and I used to just be here once or twice a week, just sitting here with all of you, and then it just went away. I don't know, I guess that's what death is probably like too. It just goes away. And then you sort of have, when you come back, there's this vague familiarity, like somehow I know this, but I'm not quite exactly sure why I know this and how I know this. Brenda, would you be kind enough to shut that door? It's a little chilly. Thank you. Okay, why don't we start with a prayer, and then we'll go into our evening. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your living presence, the presence of Christ and all the Masters, so that we will know that we are not alone in this world. When we feel alone, it is only because we have closed our hearts. Help us to open our hearts courageously and completely, that we may always be guided by your living presence. Om, peace. Amen. Let's just have just a moment of silence and then we'll start. Peace. Amen. It wouldn't have been quite 2 years because we closed in the middle of March. We closed just before we were going to have our school play in the middle of March. We had a dress rehearsal and never a performance. That was it. What we're talking about tonight is lots of fun, and it's Christmas with Swamiji. And so it's, I get to reminisce about things that happened that were very important in my life and important in the lives of others. And also to just try to bring us more deeply than that into an understanding of what he did and, more importantly, why he did it. All the writing, especially the book Light Bearer that I did about Swami, I always tried to speak to the principles behind what he did, so that his mere physical absence or the passage of generational time even will not separate us from what really matters. And Christmas was always something really extraordinary within the community when Swamiji was there. My experience of Christmas with him would have been from 1971 to 1986. That would have been the last one, because on Master's birthday of 87, I moved from Ananda Village to here, and then at the end of the 90s, Swami moved to Europe. In the early 2000s, he moved to India. And so he was here, there, and everywhere. And I was always here. So at Christmas time, Christmas time is a working holiday for clergy. It's not a vacation holiday. So we were always here and had to take what Swamiji had given us. Interestingly, and I'll get to that in a minute, but the send-off to shift from Ananda Village after 16 years to here actually was Christmas Eve, now that I think about it. But I'll come back to that in a moment. Christmas had basically a line in the sand. Atmajoti, I put the angels out. I didn't know if you'd intended it or not, but I saw the empty columns, and then there they were. Okay, I thought either.
I didn't get to it yet, so that's good.
That's what I figured, is you just didn't get to it yet. For those of you who are watching online, Atmajoti walked in and started eyeing a change I'd made to the altar. So I felt obligated to explain myself, to justify myself. I know you well enough. I looked at it, I thought, she forgot, or she was just done in, and she just went home without. So, let me think, going back to it. Swamiji, I don't want to use the word that Swami was sentimental, because that wouldn't be the accurate word, but he enjoyed the things he had enjoyed as a child. And I think Christmas was one of the things he really enjoyed as a child. And but the other side of it is, and I had to laugh at this myself, someone remarked about me, oh, Asha just loves Christmas. And I do actually really like it a lot. But it's also my responsibility to love Christmas, because if one is in a position of leadership in a spiritual organization, you have to be enthusiastic about the things that are needed to help everybody come into the right state of mind. So when I think back about Swamiji, I think of how I knew him when I first met him, and then how I began to understand him as years went by. And especially as I moved into a position of leadership that I didn't have before, and I began to recognize in myself things I'd seen in him that I suddenly understood in a different way. So Swamiji's life with us was to just teach us how to be good devotees. And he was teaching us how to be good devotees in a path that hadn't existed before, because all of our history has been Kali Yuga history. And now we're moving into Dwapara Yuga, and Master came as an avatar to bring a new and a special dispensation. He came to restore the original teachings of Jesus and the original teachings of Krishna, and to show us that they were the same. He wanted to show us how in Dwapara Yuga spiritual and material do not have to be kept so rigidly separated. He wanted spiritual communities. Master wanted spiritual communities where couples and families could live lives wholly dedicated to God, instead of just monks and nuns, which had been the style all through Kali Yuga. He wanted communities that were integrated into the world around them, not cloistered the way monasteries had been. Master made use of modern developments as they came about. In his lifetime, actually, it manifested as written lessons. Correspondence courses were a big deal in the 20s and the 30s. And Master, we think of them now as such old technology, so to speak, but they were really new technology, and Master jumped right into it, into advertising, into lecture tours. All of that was all new, but much more deeply, he wanted to teach us how to live in Dwapara Yuga 100% dedicated to God. And nobody knew how to do it. And so everything that Master did, and then Swamiji after him, was not merely because Swami loved Christmas. but because he wanted to show us how to be. And it really was, Swami created a whole culture of self-realization. How do you be a Western disciple in modern times, completely dedicated to God? What do you wear? What do you eat? How do you celebrate? How do you enjoy each other's company? How do you be spiritual? Just everything like that. And, of course, Master wanted us to have a new relationship with Jesus that wasn't based on all the church-oriented realities. And I was starting to say there was sort of a line in the sand with Ananda's understanding of Jesus. And that was before Swami wrote the oratorio and after he wrote the oratorio. It's quite fitting that Swami's communication would happen through music. But he wrote the oratorio, I think the first year that we had it, he finished it in 1984, I think. Yes, I'm pretty sure that's when it was. He started writing it at the end of 83 and finished it in 84. So we didn't really have it till 1984 Christmas. And that was the only way I could think to say it was our vibration for Jesus. And it's not that we didn't have traditional carols, and in fact, in a few minutes I'm going to share with you, before Swami wrote his own oratorio, we always listened to Handel's Messiah on Christmas. And the Christmas that Swami really instituted, he instituted it the first year that I was there. There had been all-day meditation. The 8-hour meditation, I believed he'd been doing it all the way through. I wasn't there, of course, earlier, but my understanding was he created Master's 3-day Christmas, because that's how Master did it. The 23rd was an 8-hour meditation. Christmas Eve was a social event. Christmas Day was a social event. Master first did it in 2 days. The 8-hour meditation was Christmas Eve, and then Christmas Day there was a banquet. But everybody had to stay up all night cooking in order to make that work, so he took mercy on them and he moved it back a day. And when I was there in 1971 and I was running the kitchen, and food being a big part of these things, Swami decided that we would go full story with it. And the 8-hour meditation was already in place, because that was usually there. But then on Christmas Eve, Swami wanted to have a big party. And big party, there were like 35 or 50 people was the whole community. And we had this, what we called the common dome, which was the dining room there. And that would be the party scene. And Swamiji, in those years, he read a P.G. Wodehouse story to us on Christmas Eve, which you hardly think of as like the epitome of what Christmas Eve was all about. But he wanted us to be relaxed and very joyful. And when he would read us those stories in his way, there's recordings of him, he was just so enamored of Wodehouse as a humorist and as a writer, and he would throw himself into the accents, and he would sit, he actually would put a chair on the serving table so that we could all see him. There's these pictures of Swami sitting there where usually the dishes would be spread out. And he would just read us this P.G. Wodehouse story, and we just learned to be at ease with each other and to relax and to know that it was okay. We'd spent the day before in this very serious meditation, and Swamiji had, in the afternoon, he would play this series of songs. Again, he hadn't written that much music at that point. So he had pieces from operas, he had other classical pieces. The melody that became the Divine Mother song is a tenor and bass duet from a French opera, and he used to play that. Songs of the Auvergne, is that what it's called, somewhere in France, these French folk songs he would play. He would play some Indian pieces. There was a tape that went around for a while that was called, Swami's Christmas music. And so we'd listen to all these different styles of music that Swami had collected from his experience, and that was our musical break during that. And then the next day was this party. And then on Christmas morning, we would all come into the temple and we would listen to the entirety of Handel's Messiah. So that's like, I'm not sure how long it is, a couple of hours long. But Christmas morning was always early in the morning. We'd gather in the temple and then listen to that whole piece. So for me, and we did that for many years, maybe all the years, almost all the years that I was there. So every time I would hear Handel's Messiah, it would just it takes me right back. We're going to listen to about 10 minutes of it in just a moment. And then that year, Swami decided we should have an Indian banquet for lunch, which he had to teach me how to make because I didn't know anything at all about Indian food at all. And he taught me to make rasagullas, which, you make the paneer and then you boil it in sugar syrup and then you cut it open and then you put little crystallized sugar in there and then you put a couple of cardamom seeds in there and then you put it back together and then you put a little rose water in it. It was so exotic. I mean, nowadays everybody knows these things, but in 1971 nobody knew any of it. And I don't remember what else he taught me, but he had to teach me how to make everything because I didn't know how to cook at all. He wanted an Indian banquet because Master always had an Indian banquet. And after the Messiah, probably before lunch, yes, it would have been before lunch, we would exchange presents. And so there would be 50 or 70 people, maybe 100 people in there. And we'd just have this this was in our temple, this incredibly chaotic scene of people running around, giving each other presents and ripping off. And Swami would have this heap of presents around him. Everybody would bring their gifts to him. And it was just a family. It was just exactly like a family, and there was no formality, no inhibition, and everyone would watch Swami open his presents, and there would be lots of joke presents and things like that would happen, and finally that just got completely out of hand. There were just so many people and so much, and Swami said, he just began to feel embarrassed because there were just so many gifts lavished on him. He just couldn't just sit there and just have all that abundance, so we gradually changed it. But the first couple of years, that's exactly how we did it. And that first Christmas, I wrote this whole book, this whole story up in Swami Kriyananda as we've known him. I was a health food fanatic. I was not merely healthy, I was a fanatic. So Swami gives me what is known as Swami's eggnog recipe, which he freely admits he copied off a bulletin board from the Safeway, but he gets all this credit for it. Trust me, it's not the least bit original, but there it is. And I still have this version of it. And so he wanted me to make this for that event, and it involved Eagle brand sweetened condensed milk. And I never used anything in a package, anything in a can. I never used white sugar. And to my mind now, I say this, and I say this very lovingly to everyone who's 20 or 30. You couldn't possibly be as dumb as I was. It's just not possible. So there's hope for us all. That's all I can say. So he gives me this recipe, and I was in the habit, we were dirt poor, and so I often used powdered milk. And I just reasoned out that condensed milk was just thick milk. I didn't really think through that it's boiled, It's just thick milk. So I made double strength powdered milk, and then I would get honey in this big 5-gallon cans, like super industrial strength honey. It was, just barely sweeter than petroleum. I mean, it was so intense. And I sweetened the double thick powdered milk with this honey, and I substituted it for Eagle brand condensed milk. Maybe I made the whole eggnog out of powdered milk. I don't know if I used any fresh milk or not. Like, what could I have been thinking? Like, how could I have ever thought that was good? So Christmas Eve day, that first year, on Christmas Eve, it started snowing, and it turned into a blizzard, and we were up at the meditation retreat, which is 3 miles back on that dirt road. And Seva had a Volkswagen, a little Volkswagen Beetle, I guess, which was a pretty good car for that terrain. It worked really well. And so the party wasn't until the evening, but Swami had a feeling he should come a little early. So he shows up in the middle of the afternoon. He comes into the kitchen, and he's all like, "What's, do you have the eggnog? Is the eggnog ready? Can I try the eggnog?" "Sure, Swami, here it is." Swami put it in his mouth, and he's such a diplomat. He puts it in his mouth. He walks over to the sink, and he very delicately goes, he didn't exactly spit it. He just released it, into the sink. And then he said, in one of just the most perfect way, he says, "Doesn't taste quite as I remember it," he said. And I mean, I'd never had eggnog. I had no idea what it was supposed to taste like. Swami actually said about me later that I was so mental that I actually couldn't taste things. And I actually think that was exactly the truth. And I just realized like 2 days ago, for heaven's sakes, that's why he put me in the kitchen, is because it was just so hands-on, so down-to-earth, so practical. It was just to try to grab my little brain and bring it somewhere into the real world. But so we established that it wasn't quite what he wanted, and I expressed to him that I'd made certain alterations that I thought were going to be improvements, but apparently they really weren't. It's now a full blizzard outside, and Swami's determined that we're going to rescue this eggnog, and the nearest grocery store to the meditation retreat is in North San Juan, which meant you had to go back out the 3 miles of unpaved road, and then you had to go about 5 miles to this little town that was as big as a gas station, where there was a little mini mart. And he said, I said, "Well, we don't have the ingredients." He said, "Well, Seva will go get them." I remember saying, "Sir, there's a blizzard outside." He said, "Seva's a very good driver," just like that. And so he sent Seva off. And she was like about an hour later, she returns with this tiny little mini mart, these little cans of Eagle brand condensed milk and everything that we needed, and we started over for the whole thing. Of course, it's a lesson I never forgot. Imagine that they had it there. And Swami was just so cheerful about it, and Seva was just so cheerful about it. And there were so many lessons in it, not the least of which were personal, but also it was like, if you're going to do it right. And if you meet an obstacle, then just face into it. It was just like his energy was, no, this is required. And it would have been so easy to say, what difference does it make? My mind would have said, what difference would it make? Well, partly, he'd set his mind to it. He wanted me to understand, you set your mind to something, you just do it. And everybody just loved the eggnog. I made the eggnog, and I did not make it with powdered milk or honey. Some people suggested I should make both versions, but no, I don't think so. I think we can trust that the other one was just really hard. And we had a really lovely, lovely night. It wasn't only my first Christmas at Ananda, it was actually my first Christmas ever, because I was raised Jewish. And of course, Christmas touches us, but I think it was just the first time. I mean, of course, I'd been at Ananda Village by that point since the 1st of June. So it was December 24th by then. And I'd had many wonderful experiences, but nothing quite like that Christmas Eve. Just the common dome, as we called it, it was probably about the area from where the chairs are to here. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't that big. And we did not have any electricity except with a generator, but we didn't use the generator unless we needed to. So the lighting were these propane little bulb lights. So there were just, a few of them. So the lighting in the room there were like pools of light with lots of shadows. So it was a very misty kind of feeling to it. And Kalyani, who lived there at that time, who was classically trained both as a singer and a pianist and was very talented. And we didn't have a piano, but we had a harmonium, and this harmonium was on a stand and it had foot pedals. Harmoniums were actually created, believe it or not, by English missionaries who, they called them field organs. They wanted to go out into the, the wilds of the world and convert people to Christianity, and they wanted to have something that sounded like their hymns. So they took them to India, and then Indians immediately saw what the benefit of these were. So this one was set up so you could play with both feet, so she could play like this. And Swami stood next to her, sort of in this, near one of the lights, in this golden light. He stood next to her. And she had this beautiful soprano voice, and she could cite, just turn the pages of the music and either sing it or play it. And so with the two of them anchoring this, and Ananda's always attracted artists and musicians because all of Krishna's soldiers look like Krishna. So Satchidananda's ashram, Integral Yoga Institute, he was an engineer, and all his people could build and fix machines. They were just all like him. But in our place, almost no one could fix machines, and we could all sing and dance and do that sort of thing. So Swami was there, and Kalyani was there, and they just started singing, and everybody crowded around like that. And I was a little bit at a distance, partly because I was, taking care of things. But I was also, just for my own reasons, I was standing back a little and just watching this. And I'd never heard... the way I felt about it is I'd never seen such deep and spontaneous worship. Just like it was like it taught me what it is to worship, and that it's just a natural expression of who we are. It's not like something that you get organized and everybody goes to the church and here's the written response. It's not that Ananda was anything like that, but the context of that was a party in which, we'd had refreshments and all of these things like that. Swami had been reading us P.G. Wodehouse. The other part of it that was so striking to me was how easily Swami just went from one thing to another. He's in the kitchen teaching me how to make eggnog. He's sitting on the dais there reading P.G. Wodehouse, and we're just laughing so hard we can hardly, just hardly stay in our chairs because he is so funny. And then, let's sing Christmas carols. And all of a sudden, we're in Hiranyaloka with choirs of angels, just one after another, these songs just rolling out of his heart. And Swami, of course, and Kalyani both, they just were so at ease singing. There wasn't the slightest sense of, we have to do it right, or people this, Swami could just open his mouth and give music, and Kalyani was just the same. And so it was like the music was just what would you say? Well, I listened. It was like the music was already there and they opened the window to it. And I just, that very first Christmas, I learned where I was and why I was there. And I really, and I'll tell you just an odd part of this, and I will add this in here. After that first Christmas, it was an issue because most of us were quite young. We were still in our 20s mostly. And our parents expected us to go home for Christmas. I was so glad I was Jewish because there was no expectation. But there was a lot of the people had to make this decision. And Swamiji told us, I think he even told us that first year, he certainly told us the second year, don't go to your parents for Christmas. It's too sacred a holiday. It's a spiritual opportunity that should not be squandered in worldly environments. Go home for Thanksgiving or go for New Year's, or go right after, but don't leave during Christmas, which was, it was a really hard thing for people. So after that first Christmas, for years afterwards, I would tell people, even if they disown you, really doesn't make any difference. Let them disown you. Just be there. I mean, this, of course, with Swami, just participating completely as casually as we are here. And then I was actually, goodness, it would have been that much later. I feel like I was already here, which would have been 15 years later, but I feel like this realization came sooner. I was going through a very tumultuous period of time that Christmas. And the reason I was at a distance is because I was huddled over here being miserable when everybody else was having such a good time. But I didn't remember any of that. I mean, literally, I remembered that Christmas Eve as being just limitlessly happy. And oddly, just years later, I remembered, actually, no, I was very emotionally upset in a very negative way that night. But it disappeared. And that was when I realized, oh my gosh, the personality and the soul are really two different things, aren't they? And that experience, although it didn't catch up with me for a few years, gave me an entirely different attitude toward the things that we all take so seriously, which is how do I feel right now about myself and everyone else, because the soul is operating on a completely different level. And the soul doesn't really care if it's making you a little uncomfortable, if it's moving you where you're trying to go. And my soul was ecstatic. You know, this was my first Christmas ever. I had found my spiritual home. You know, my childhood fear and my adolescent fears was that I would never find a meaningful life. Because, of course, I didn't know anything about ashrams or gurus or anything like that, or meditation or self-realization. I was just wandering around like an ordinary American, and I didn't even know it was an option. And so all I could see was what I could see. And it was literally a nightmare of mine that I would just end up nowhere. And I didn't. So the fact that there was personal tumult in my life at that moment, piffle, it just didn't make a bit of difference. This was a incarnational journey that was being fulfilled at this point. And that was what Christmas did for us. That 8 hours of meditation, the music, the laughter, the family, it just told us that there's a whole other reality out there. And these are living masters. You know, that's what also happened. It's like, fortunately, I didn't have any prejudice against Jesus. I didn't really know, but I really was introduced to him by Swamiji. It was like, oh, this is who it is. Because it didn't, even though I studied self-realization for a few years before I met Swami, I never thought about Jesus. Why would I? Because it was Master's unique contribution to bring all of that back together. So, that was much more than I intended to say before I do what we're about to do, which is in 2 hours or more of Messiah music, I managed to pull out about 11 minutes. And so I thought we would just listen to it, and we can all pretend, if you like, that you're back in that isolated temple all those decades ago, and that Swami Kriyananda is sitting right next to us, which I think he is, just with his eyes closed, just listening to this extraordinary piece of music. Handel had a superconscious experience when he wrote this, and it's perfectly obvious when you listen to it. I had the hardest time choosing. I just kept adding and subtracting, and then listening to a few more pieces and then going back. I think it's inherent in the music, but it's also extraordinarily evocative. So why don't we listen to this, and then I'll go on and talk about a few more things. Okay.
hill made low. The crook is straight, the crook is straight, the crook is straight, and the rough place is plain, and the rough place is plain, and the rough place is plain.
I don't know what to do. Let's just sit for a couple of minutes and we'll go on. You hear that, and it's a full oratorio. This is the Christmas part of it. I mean, it's a fraction of the Christmas part of it. But then it goes on into his crucifixion, and I didn't know how to put in, I know that my Redeemer liveth, after all of that, but that's still one of the... But it's interesting because this oratorio, which is what it means, Life of Christ in music, was what Swami would offer us every Christmas, and then he wrote his own. And then all of a sudden it was just like, even though this is extremely stirring and beautiful in countless ways, the whole feeling and the whole power of it is entirely different. And it's not something that a community could sing together, or because you have to be skilled and you have to have so much more and all of that. And Swamiji always wrote his music for the community to sing. He didn't just write it to be heard, he wrote it so that we could sing it. And so the oratorio that he wrote, which was obviously so much less, I don't know what the word is, less outward, much more inward. But beautiful, but just entirely different, because when Swami went to Israel and went to all those places, he felt the inspiration in a very different way. But this had been his what he would present to us. Swami used to listen to classical music a great deal of the time. He used to listen to music while he would write. So you would often come in, he was very well educated musically, and you would often be hearing classical music in his house. And sometimes in the evenings we would listen to classical pieces just as relaxation. He had there was a wonderful cellist, Jacqueline Dupree, whose story was quite dramatic because she developed MS. But he had an album of hers and a couple of pieces he particularly loved. And sometimes in the evening after supper, he would just have us play that. I'm remembering a humorous story which I can switch to. He liked this one particular piece a great deal, but he didn't like the piece that came after it. So we were listening, and it was a record player, just like this, and so it was one groove, and then it was going to be the next. And just as the piece he liked finished, he didn't want to have that mood broken by the next one. He said, "Asha, would you stop that?" And I got up, and I was halfway to the record player, and then this horrible feeling came through me. Did you mean the record? I just thought he was just giving me a global instruction to change my consciousness. At that point, yes, Asha, of course I meant the record. I went like this. This is like your whole life flashes before your eyes, and you just sort of, it became a long-standing joke after that when I explained to him the horror that had come over me. But when Swami, now I'm skipping around, but when it got to the point where we could sing ourselves an oratorio, and Swami he went to Israel in 1984 just with Rosanna, who was the woman he married the year after. And Rosanna was deeply devoted to Jesus and had never been to the Holy Land. So for her it was an extraordinary, she was a very, very, she's still living, very bhakti, just full of love. And Swami went with her, the two of them went on that trip. And Swami had been to Israel once before for one day, but he hadn't really done this. And partly because of her overwhelming devotion to it, he was also drawn into it, but he was just drawn into it. And after he came back, he hadn't come to America yet, he'd come to Sorrento where Rosanna lived. And he woke up one morning with a melody for, I think it was the Holy Sepulchre was the one that came first, if I'm not mistaken. And all of a sudden, the vibration of the experience of the place to him was expressing itself in music, in a melody. And then he thought, well, if I have that one, maybe there's others. And without getting out of bed, he had a little tape recorder, and he would whistle or sing the melody as he heard it into the tape recorder so he could keep it. And he said, I wonder if I can have others. And before he got out of bed that morning, he had 21 melodies that became the oratorio just by, he would put himself back to wherever he was, King David's tomb, the Sea of Galilee, wherever it might be, all those different places, the Church of the Dormition, which is the Mother of Wisdom song. And it just, his vibration, the spiritual vibration would translate into melody. Swami always said that language is, music is an exact language. And that's why he always was so particular. If you just switched one note, he would come to you and tell you had to get it right. He wasn't casual. And he said, I'm sorry to be so strict, but he said, this is how I heard it. If he had just written it, there would be room for interpretation, but he always said, this is how I heard it. And this is how you say David's tomb. This is how you say the Holy Sepulchre from the point of view of how he felt it. And so he had all those, and then he just started in writing it. At the time, Rosanna was involved with a charismatic Catholic group in Italy, and there was this union forming, not just them personally, but between our two entities. This is Christmas. This is all about Christmas. And our theology was very different. But he thought if we could all love Jesus together in the same way, then the theological differences wouldn't matter. So he was inspired to do the oratorio anyway, but he was there was a tremendous incentive in the hope that he could, through that group, sort of infiltrate the traditional churches with something of Master's vibration, because through music, it's not theology, it's just music. And he could help them to understand it in a different way. Listening to, I picked two of the really big pieces. Not every piece is really big like that. But hearing that and then remembering how we sing, and the sort of, the melodies are different. And you can really feel what that is. And so so having just sort of said all this about Christmas, I'll just skip to this part. When he wrote the oratorio, and he finished it in January, February of '84. So it was happening through that Christmas. Yeah, it was happening through that Christmas because his house, I was living then in the little, what is the guest house of Crystal Hermitage? It had just been built, and they were remodeling his house downstairs, and he came back from Italy, and he was really working on the oratorio just like this, and his house was full of workmen. And so we switched houses. And in between, the downstairs place, his place, the pipes burst and it flooded, and all the furniture was stacked up in the corners, and there were workmen in there, and I discovered that the heater there never worked. Swami lived there for 12 years, and the wood stove was not installed properly, and we were going to build him his new apartment anyway, but my little sojourn in his apartment really made it. I said, sir, how have you done that? And he just accepted it. But he was over in the guest house there, and Karin Levin was his housekeeper at that time. She died in the end of the 90s, and she was from the Tyrol. She was European, and she put up a Christmas tree for him and put real candles on it. And so he's finishing the oratorio, sitting in this house, and the house has, if you've ever been in, it has big windows, a big window like this. So at nighttime, the Christmas tree would reflect, how a window with the dark night behind it, because it was just a canyon there. So she would light those candles in this little Christmas tree, and then it would reflect off of the wall, so there would be like a dozen Christmas trees in there. And he just worked day and night. He had no sense of time. When he would just be too exhausted, he would call somebody to come over and just have a little social time. But just day and night, he just worked on it, just trying to get it through. And then he would hand the music to the choir. You must have been there at that time. And he would give it to the singers and have them sing it. And he would, listen to see. And sometimes he would change something, but usually he didn't. Usually by the time he gave it to the choir. And so he would be hearing it in his mind, and then they would gather at Crystal Hermitage, and because the upstairs was okay, and then they would sing it for him, and then he'd go back and work on it again. And I tell this story in Lightbearer, but he would just call you whenever he felt like phoning. He didn't really think it was late or early, although we tended to stay up late, and he knew that. But about 11 or 12 at night, probably about midnight one night, when he was doing all this, he called and he asked if I would come over, which was just, a 2-minute walk. I walked over and he showed me the lyrics to the song that became You Remain Our Friend, which was for the crucifixion. And he had the lyrics written out and he showed it to me like this, and it wasn't that good. I mean, it just wasn't good enough. And you had to be very diplomatic with Swami because he was being creative. You don't want to just say, oh, that's bad, Swami, it just doesn't work. And rarely was anything not perfect, but it just wasn't quite right. And so I prayed, what do I say? I said, well, Swamiji, not every song in the oratorio is going to be the best song in the oratorio. And he knew exactly what I said. He said, that's what I thought. And then he just sent me home. And I think he called about 5 the next morning. And he had gotten it to the point where it is right now. So one mustn't ever think for a moment that any of that was effortless. He was constant. And then his body totally began to break down. He started having what they medically call congestive heart failure, which is just a horrible sounding thing, but that is exactly what it is. It's congestive heart failure if it continues. And his extremities started swelling up, and he was very short of breath. And he just said it like this: Satan is trying to stop me, and I won't let him. And Dr. Peter was monitoring his health, and he just went like this. He finished the oratorio, and the next day he was fine. All his symptoms just stopped. He just knew. He knew what was really happening. And then from that point, and Swami also, it was a changing point for him musically. He said it was the first time he'd ever written music. He said he'd written music to express ideas, but this was the first time he wrote music to express a vibration, was how he put it. And he wrote a lot of music that was different after this song. So that Christmas, we had our usual Christmas, whatever it was, what I'm describing. But the whole pattern of that one was these songs that were coming out. And this whole, since the early 80s, it was around that time that we all began to travel a lot. And in the subsequent years, all of us, we have a place in Italy and a place in India now, and people have been to the Holy Land and been on pilgrimages in so many different places. But we were really homebound before that. And homebound in the best possible way, which is it was a universe unto itself. And it was very important that it be that, because he was creating with us something that hadn't existed before. And we had to be uninterrupted in our ability to find it. And we had to be undiluted by constant interaction. He'd sent Jyotish and Devi to San Francisco for a few years, and the San Francisco house continued. They were beginning, and East West was bought in 1981, but still the heart and soul of it was Ananda Village. It hadn't really dispersed in the same way. And we were all really trying to find the vibration. When I think of it now, I've never thought of it this way, but when I was writing Lightbearer, especially the first round of seclusion, I drove literally 1,000 miles up to Anand and Kirtani's little cabin up by Canada in the state of Washington. And I was in the house itself, like the nearest neighbor was like 2 miles away. You could see across the valley. There was nothing there, just nothing. And there was no internet, there was nothing, no phone. And because I needed to be able to feel what that book was supposed to be. And I just had to have I needed to have a blank slate. I couldn't handle any interruption like that. And that's what we were doing that first 10, 12, even 15 years at Ananda Village. We just needed to be able to hear and feel what this lifestyle was supposed to be. I think Swami took us out to San Francisco every once in a while and sent various of us out on various adventures because we were strong enough in what we were doing to start. We would get stronger from a little interaction. But it was always, you were leaving home and then you'd get to come back. The average lifespan of a colony leader, a center leader, was 18 months. You did 12 months of good work, and then you spent 6 months trying to persuade Swami that you could come home. And then you did. It didn't change until Ananta Maria and us when we came here. But so when he was doing that, when I think back just on that Christmas, and it was also, when we had the oratorio was about the only period of time where we just spontaneously burst into song, which he's always wanted us to just be so free that we can, but we just would spontaneously burst into song because we knew Swami loved to hear the songs. He was always confirming them, like every time he would hear it, it would be like, yes, that's just what it felt like. So there was this spirit of Jesus carried literally from Jerusalem through Swamiji, which was an experience none of us had yet had. After that, Swami himself took a group and they sang the oratorio all through the Holy Land. But at that point it was through him and to an extent through Rosanna that the music came out like that. And I think it's like it taught us how to be yogi devotees of Jesus. And from that point, let me just put in a few other things I remember when, let's see, the monastery was very big and sort of a very much more of a focus through the 70s. And Swamiji wanted, on Christmas Eve morning, he would have the monks and nuns over for breakfast. And so we would spend the morning with him and then the evening with the whole community. And so there were 30 or so at that point, and I was the one who would cook for him. And somehow in all of that, the Christmas breakfast became blintzes. I don't know why. Somehow I just thought of that. So we'd make all these crepes and wrap them around the sweet cream thing. And one year, for reasons I can't figure out, I've been trying to figure out how this happened. Everything was very simple and it was very cold, and there was no refrigerator big enough to keep all this stuff overnight. So we put it into Shraddha von Tobel, not the Shraddha that's living now. This was another woman. We put all the breakfast in her little Volkswagen and locked it up and closed it all up against the animals. And for some reason, the circumstances I can't conjure, we lost the key. And for reasons I also can't remember, I don't know where Shraddha was, why we couldn't ask her. So we broke the window, which Shraddha never forgave me. But I told her that there was just no choice. We just had to do it. So we broke the window and took the blintzes down. And then we just have this wonderful informal time with Swamiji. Yeah, that was really fun. Hot chocolate, and nobody had diabetes or cholesterol at that point. We might have created it, but we didn't have it at that point. Everything was just so rich and lavish. But this would be sort of the feeling. After the monastery fell apart, dissolved, transformed, Swami would still have those Christmas breakfasts. And he would invite, I think we stopped making blintzes or other people started cooking, I don't exactly recall, but he would have a group of people over on Christmas morning, and that also became just part of the family spirit. And then several things started happening. After the monasteries broke up, all of a sudden we started having children. And the families became more in tune with what we were doing with Ananda. Before that point, the family energy was not in tune with what Swami was doing, so we didn't try to combine them. Oh, I know what I was starting to say. The Christmas Eve parties began to get more and more complicated, and for somehow or another, the monks, maybe it was because the nuns made the breakfast, the monks started doing skits on Christmas Eve of varying quality. It's the only thing I could say. Lots of enthusiasm, but varying degrees of artistry. And I don't know if it was for Christmas or if it was for another occasion, but a lot of the people at Ananda had a sort of either a rock and roll background, and it was rock and roll then, rock and roll background and so on. So Haridas, Agni, and I don't know who the others were, they made a little rock and roll band, and they called it Hari Om and the Tot-Sots. And I rode back to Ayodhya in the car with Swami Kalyani and Agni. And that one, even though it was really irreverent, was really good. They did it really, really well. So all the way back in the car, Kalyani is excoriating Agni for just the blasphemous nature. How dare he, Hari Om and the Tot-Sots. I mean, really. And most of us, the others in the car, were just silent. Seva must have been there too. So all the way there like that. And we finally get to Swami's house. And Swami lets, the three women were going into the house with Swami because we often would sort of be the last ones to leave him. So we went into the house. I was outside. The two girls went in the house. Kalyani got in. I'm outside with Swami. Agni's still there. Swami turns to Agni and says, "I thought it was very funny." Then he just walks in, which was also vintage Kriyananda. It's like he wasn't going to fight with Kalyani in front of all of us, but he also didn't want Agni to think that he actually agreed with her. So he just kind of moved it in such a way. He was always conscious. I mean, anybody else would have told Kalyani to be quiet or, just something, and just created different difficulty. Swami was always aware of everybody's needs in a situation like that. Just another thing similar to that. Agni was a very good singer. He had just a certain, I don't know how to say it exactly. He had a very charismatic voice, but it wasn't operatic, it wasn't trained, but it was very charismatic. And we were sitting, this is not to do with Christmas, but this is how sensitive Swami was. And we were sitting in apartment 108, actually, over there, around the big table. Sometimes when Swami would come, there'd be 12 or more people at this table. And Swami said to Agni that he thought he should make an album of the Shakespeare songs because Agni's voice was more suitable for the Shakespeare songs than Swami's was. And then everybody started thinking about the bawdy lyrics and, "Oh, mistress mine, come and kiss me sweet and 20, and, that sort of thing. And everyone at the table mostly started teasing Agni. And Swami was just silent, and he sort of let it run. And then after it was done, he said, "Agni, I think your voice would be very suitable for the Shakespeare songs." But it was just like, and if you were paying any attention, you could feel how inappropriate we had been. And because, people put up with things like that kind of teasing, but they don't necessarily enjoy it. And Swami he always knew. He always knew who you really were and what you really needed. And you had to watch and you had to pay attention to really understand it, but it was extraordinary. It was an extraordinary lesson. And you see, that's what he would bring. So you're sitting there listening to the Messiah with him, and he's brought his consciousness. We're sitting there having blintzes for breakfast, and because he always lived it, he never took a holiday from his consciousness, and he didn't enjoy low energy. He didn't enjoy coarse energy. He didn't enjoy unkindness. He just didn't. Once he was explaining something to me and he made a statement, and so I told them so and so. Then he corrected himself. He said, but phrased like that, it sounds accusatory. He said, and I never speak in an accusatory manner. He was just being quick with me to explain it, but he wanted me to understand that he had not expressed himself that way, because I never speak in an accusatory manner. And it wasn't hyperbole when he would say that, because it was his consciousness. So when he gave us the oratorio, it was like we were really, and he said it himself, this was my inner vibration. He was really teaching us something. And I feel like at that point, we knew how to be yogis and also be devoted to Jesus. Before that, we were having Christmas. We were doing all of it. And we were doing it in a pretty good way. But at that point, it just turned deeper. It was like it was explained to us how we could do it. So then the Christmas things, the Christmas Eve started getting a little raucous. and I'm not quite sure how we got it back from the monks. It wasn't that it wasn't funny, but we all began to feel that we'd pushed it a little too far, and we needed to pull it back a little bit to something that was more centered. Eventually what happened at Ananda Village is they basically turned Christmas Eve over to the families, to the children, and they started having an early evening service, and sort of everything that had been part of that Christmas Eve, it just gradually went away. But I was gone by then, so I'm not even really qualified to say. I'm just looking at it from the edge. So when we were here and had to make a decision, we tried to keep Christmas, because it became a dispute. Can the children come to the Christmas Eve service? But if the children come to the Christmas Eve, then it turns into a children's party. And so here we decided Christmas Eve is for adults, Christmas Day is for children. Because these were the problems that had been set up. And then what got added to Christmas Eve was we actually had a barn and we had animals. We had a manger, like a real manger. So somewhere early on, someone had the wonderful idea that we would have a living creche. And I don't know whether they always, when we were doing that here for a while, whichever couple in the community had most recently had a baby, they got to be Joseph and Mary and Jesus. But not all babies were equally interested in being Jesus. And after one Jesus spent the entire time under mother's shawl nursing, we decided that there might be a better solution than that. And of course, there were a couple of the ones that just cried continuously, thinking the whole thing was a horrid experience. But sometimes I think at the barn, so it came to the point where we would have that party. Swami would entertain us, we would drink eggnog, we would do the Christmas carols. Then we'd all pile, everything was still at the retreat, we'd all pile into our cars and we'd go back down all the way to the village, to the farm, and walk literally into a literal stable. Then we'd sing more Christmas carols. So I have these pictures in my mind too of just walking next to Swami, because I was almost always in his car. We would, just standing there. And again, there you are, there's the baby Jesus. But there's another, just last part that occurred to me was, let's see how to say it. It was so gratifying for Swamiji to watch us actually become real devotees. And it wasn't gratifying in the sense of I did it, not like that. But he watched us become in tune. And oftentimes I would sort of, as I think back on it, that's one of the things I won't say he was a proud Papa, because that would require ego, which he didn't have. But he was a delighted Papa. We'd come all the way down to the barn, and he had nothing to do with it. And people had just worked so hard to make this so beautiful and thought it through as the best way that they could. And there he's standing there just with all of this and seeing this extraordinary energy that Master had put through him, When I came to live here, which was now, if you can believe it, in 1 year it'll be 36 years. Master's birthday, 2023, is 36 years. Unbelievable. And at that point, as I said earlier, the average lifespan of a colony leader was 18 months. And the thought form of our places outside of Ananda village was that their only purpose was to find people who were sincere and then have them move to the village. Which meant that you could never actually get anything going, because anytime anybody had any potential, it was essentially expected that you would persuade them to leave your center and then go up to the village. This seemed to us like an impractical concept, because how would we ever have anything if we didn't really, if it weren't possible to get in tune by not living at the village. If the only place that you could get in tune with Master was the village, then we were in trouble. So the project, and the timing of it was interesting. I mean, Jyotish and Devi did many great souls who made their life at Ananda, have made their life at Ananda, came through the San Francisco house when Jyotish and Devi were running it. And Dhyana and Ram ran it afterwards, and Biraj actually had a stint there, Parvati and Pranaba. So all that did good work, very good work. I don't mean to say that. But the idea that we could really establish another reality that would endure, now it seems self-evident, but it wasn't at that point. It was, is it possible? And that was the question, on our side too, which is like, is it possible? And we just started doing everything that we could think of to recreate everything that was possible. And I was starting to say, in 1986, Swamiji was in Assisi and he took a seclusion in November. We went to India for the first time, went on a pilgrimage trip to India, and on the way home, went to Italy. That was a pattern that we developed. We go to India and then we go to Italy and just freeze in the Italian winter, and especially at the beginning because the houses had no heat. We come from warm India to freezing Italy. He had been in seclusion, and he came out of seclusion. They had just moved from Lake Como down to Assisi, and they were in this old church called San Fortunato. And we arrived from India, the group arrived from Lake Como, and Swami came out of seclusion, all like this, like virtually on the same day. And he'd written the Festival of Light. And nobody knew he was going to do it, and uncharacteristically, he didn't tell anybody while he was doing it. Usually Swami kept everyone informed. He didn't tell anyone, he just shows up. He has this ritual. And there was this little stone chapel in that church. It's not the place we are now. They were renting this other place. He calls us into this little stone room. He hands Lakshman Simpson, not the Lakshman you know now, but the Lakshman who was a tremendous musician. He hands him the songs that he's written. And Swami reads the first festival, the first time. I believe I have a recording of it. And we all just were there. It was the most out of time, out of place experience perhaps I've ever had. It's because it was like this little stone room. Were we in the catacombs? Were we in a Himalayan cave? Were we in the astral world? I have no idea. And Swami's reading it in this very undramatic, but very, very feeling. He just reads the whole thing and then tells us, now you come up here and now I'll bless you and now I'll do this and like this. And he was telling Lakshman what to do with the song and so on like that. And he said he'd always thought that Ananda needed some ritual, but every time he thought about it, it was never the time. And then suddenly when he was in seclusion, it was the time. So he did it like that. So then he brought it home, and he told us that some of us would be light bearers. He told us that we would start wearing white robes. And it had already been planned to move it in January, and so now this is the very end of November. He comes back in December, and so that whole Christmas was about the festival. And for the first time, and he would perform it at the chapel at Crystal Hermitage, and then a few different people would do it. And Christmas Eve, I'm not entirely, it was the end of my 16 years at Ananda Village, was Christmas Eve there. And I was heading off to do this, and you know, I was not quite 40. I was 40, actually, when I got here. But it was a really, it was an extraordinary change. I was leaving Swami. I'd lived next door to him literally for most of those 16 years. And I was going to have all this responsibility. I was going to have to live in the city, which I swore I would never do again. You know, just all these different things. But then we were there for that Christmas Eve, and his blessing to us, I was trying to remember that was actually considered to be an ordination as a light bearer. It's not clear to me. But there was no question that this was the transfer of spiritual energy, was being there and having him bless us, because we were on our way to do something else for Master. And I remember feeling suddenly, I think the actual word is confident. I just of course we can do this. You know, there was just the energy was so powerful, and it was the other part of it was so clear. Just don't overcomplicate this, thinking about where you're going to live and what you're going to do and how people are going to work, and how, you know, just like all the things that I was saying. How on earth are we going to make this work? Don't overcomplicate this. Just love God. And I swore, you know, that what Swami was giving to us, we would give to others. And that was the only, and that became the job definition. And for many years, and even still to this day, I just go back to there, capture that vibration, because all the rest of it is just a means to an end. You know, this place wouldn't mean anything if it didn't have that vibration. And where does that vibration come from? It comes from Swami, who got it from Master, who just sends it down to all of us. So that was Christmas. And that really was Christmas. So I think we should sing some Christmas carols. Karen has come to play the piano for us. And why don't we just choose some of the very bestest ones? I would prefer that we kind of huddled around the piano rather than sit so formally in these chairs, but if people are comfortable with that, we can sort of, at least we don't have to be, because otherwise it's not family, otherwise it's two. Okay.
Yeah, and you can stand too if you want to just enjoy not sitting.
I know we're all still afraid of each other, but you can get as close as you would get in any other situation.
Yeah, and so Asha, I have this list. You want to choose what you'd like to start with?
I gave Karen a list of the ones I thought Swami liked the most, which is the most obvious classical.
Yeah. Well, so why don't we start with "O Come, All Ye Faithful"? Oh, come, all ye faithful.
Oh, and we have eggnog, so you don't leave before you have eggnog.
Do you want to do eggnog first?
Do you want eggnog?
Listen, we should probably do eggnog first. No?
Okay.
What do you think?
Oops. We're going to do eggnog first.
Okay, not first.
happy morning, Jesus, to thee be glory given. Word of the Father, thou in flesh appearing, oh come let us adore him. Oh come let us adore him. Oh come let us adore him, Christ the Lord.
And do you have the Latin? Do you have Latin in your version or no? No.
I do
Okay,
not.
very good. That's we haven't done that. How about Joy to the World? And I think your book is alphabetical, so it should be easy to find.
Joy to the world, the Lord has come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room, and heaven and nature sing, and heaven and nature sing, and heaven and nature sing. Joy to the world, the Savior reigns. Let men their songs employ. Where fields and floods, rocks, hills and plains, repeat the sounding joy, repeat the sounding joy, repeat the sounding joy. He rules the world with truth and grace, and makes the nations prove the glories of his righteousness, and wonders of his love, and wonders of his love, and wonders of his love.
Beautiful. You can turn my mic down just a little bit so you guys can all hear each other. How about angels we have heard on high? Angels we have heard on high. All right. Let's see.
Angels we have heard on high, sweetly singing o'er the plains, and the mountains in reply, echoing their joyous strains. Gloria in excelsis Deo. Gloria in excelsis Deo. Shepherds, why this jubilee? What your joyous strains belong? What the gladsome tidings be that inspire your heavenly song? Gloria in excelsis Deo. Gloria in excelsis Deo. Come to Bethlehem and see him whose birth the angels sing. Come adore on Christ the Lord, the newborn King. Gloria in excelsis Deo. Gloria in excelsis Deo.
That's right.
Silent night, holy night, all is gone, all is bright, round Virgin Mother and Child, holy infant so tender and mild, sleep in heavenly peace, sleep in heavenly peace. Silent night, holy night, shepherds quake at the sight, glories stream from heaven afar, heavenly hosts sing hallelujah. Christ the Savior is born. Christ the Savior is born. Silent night, holy night, Son of God, love's pure light, radiant beams from thy holy face, with the dawn of redeeming grace. Jesus, Lord, at thy birth. Jesus, Lord, at thy birth. What child is this who laid to rest on Mary's lap is sleeping, whom angels greet with anthems sweet, while shepherds watch are sleeping. This is Christ the King, whom shepherds warn and angels sing. Haste to bring him laud, the babe, the Son of Mary. So bring him incense, gold, and myrrh. Come, peasant king, to own him, the King of kings. Salvation brings. Let loving hearts enthrone him. Raise, raise a song on high. The Virgin sings her lullaby. Joy, joy for Christ is born, the babe, the Son of Mary. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, and mourns in lonely exile here, until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. O come, spring, come and cheer our spirits by thine advent here. Disperse the gloomy clouds of night, and death's dark shadows put to flight. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. O come, thou Key of David, come, and open wide our heavenly home. Make safe the way that leads to thee, and close the path of misery. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. O come, thou King of all the earth, that we may share thy wondrous birth. Come rule our heart and mind and will, that we thy precepts may fulfill. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel.
Yeah, I think there are three.
Oh, the manger, no crib for a bed. The little Lord Jesus laid down his sweet head. The stars in the sky looked down where he lay. The little Lord Jesus asleep on the hay. The cattle are lowing, the poor baby wakes, but little Lord Jesus no crying he makes. I love thee, Lord Jesus, look down from the sky, and stay by my cradle till morning is nigh. Be near me, Lord Jesus, I ask thee to stay close by me forever, and love me, I pray. Bless all the dear children in thy tender care, and take us to heaven to live three mighty kings did bow their heads to a gentle babe of low degree, whom men call the Son of Mary. Who tell to me this mystery, how a tiny babe in a manger laid could so many hearts to love persuade, this holy Son of Mary. Shepherds came and knelt in wonder there, seeing him in light beyond compare, and his eyes that told them all love was he, whom men call the Son of Mary. Who tell to me this mystery, how a tiny babe in a manger laid could so many hearts to love persuade, this holy Son of Mary. Wonderful it was that Christmas day, how from far and near they came to pray, how from far they glimpsed His majesty, whom men call the Son of Mary. Oh, tell to me this mystery, how a tiny babe in a manger laid could so many hearts to love persuade, this holy Son of Mary. Could it be that in the little one, Spirit's universal love did shine? If it's true, He lives in you and me, whom men call the Son of Mary. Who tell to me this mystery, how a tiny babe in a manger laid could so many hearts to love persuade, this holy Son of Mary. Clear in the darkness a light shines in Bethlehem. Angels are singing, their sound fills the air. Wise men have journeyed to greet their Messiah, but only a mother and baby lie there. Ave Maria, Ave Maria, hear the soft lullaby the angel was singing. scepter nor crown. Shepherds his flock cures, the poor for his people, but holds his scepter and love for his crown. Ave Maria, Ave Maria, hear the soft lullaby the angel sing. Ave Maria, Ave Maria, Maiden and Mother of Jesus our King. Although your treasures are not gold or incense, lay them before him with hearts full of love. Praise to the Christ child and praise to his mother, who bore us a Savior by grace from above. Ave Maria, Ave Maria, hear the soft lullaby the angel sings. Ave Maria, Ave Maria, Maiden and Mother of Jesus our King. The Christ child's asleep, the silence is so deep that round about with hope in their eyes. The animals await, their breathing they abate. They know their time has come to arise. For Jesus came on earth to offer second birth to all who would the blessing receive. The inner peace he brings can lift us on soul wings to soar in light on heaven perceive. Our pleasures and pains, our losses, our gains, have kept us long bound. The ropes of yearning hemmed us round. We dreamed of imposing on desert sand flower gardens of beauty, verdant vales of delight. Imagination misted our sight. The freedom we would know, Christ offered long ago, and even from his slumber flows beams. All creatures here on earth are alive to their own worth, can welcome love and win their release. The Christ child's asleep, the silence is so deep that round about with hope in their eyes, the animals await, their breathing I know their time has come.